Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak here, that we were invited by the Word Group here to speak as Knorr Bremse. For me, it's very important to show to you what does it mean for us to have C-part management in the direct and the indirect purchasing part. Indirect, I'll come back to that later. What has indirect purchasing to do with C-part management? Well, we were one of the trailblazers in C-part management, actually, and have, I would say, over-exaggerated it. I would have to be so clear. We really exaggerated it, and that's why we've run into some problems. But at the end of the day, we're here today to talk about problems and to find solutions together with partners, with other C-part managers. As I said, I am responsible for indirect purchasing at Knorr Bremse, come from the direct procurement. So all experience we've made with the material is something that I'm now trying to switch over together with C-part managers to the indirect procurement unit. To this end, I want to, well, first of all, introduce what is C-part management in direct procurement, as already mentioned, and then look at the superordinate aims that we have when it comes to service providers in the indirect procurement. I have to say that I'm responsible for indirect procurement, where I hold responsibility for all the customers of Knorr Brake and for the region of Europe, Middle East and Africa. Sounds very important, but well, is not so vitally important, because we simply need to make sure that our supply works across them all. Now, what, when you look at direct commodities, made us to look at C-part management and to really live it at Knorr Brake? Well, Knorr Brake is a company that sells safety. You drive with these railroads, with these trucks, with these buses. So there's people, goods that are being transported. And what does it mean when we look at C-parts? Well, it's at discs, nuts and bolts and washers, plenty of parts from plenty of suppliers. And well, we said, but look, I mean, the screw, the individual screw, that's an important component. It's an important component. How can we hand this over to a C-part supplier? Because if the chassis of a railroad is torn off, if the connecting parts are torn off, we will have, well, an incident with 300-400 fatalities. So we had a huge internal debate at our company. How do we really want to run our C-part management? Well, and as you can see, we put that onto our agenda, and as you can see, 30,000 parts is what we gave to 2 service providers, just 2 service providers. And we've got 120,000 positions that we order per year. And these, well, is what we addressed, what we looked at. And important here was, what kind of good categories do you allocate amongst these? And as you can see, it's a bit, well, written a bit small, but I hope you can still read it. You can see we looked at all the commodities with the exception of very specific electric parts, which means plugs, switches that were included or excluded, then welded construction, so larger components, I can't give them over to a C-part supplier, then cast elements, then varnished components, also something I can't give to my C-part supplier, then chemicals, to a limited extent, of course you can sometimes give that to a C-part supplier, then glass or other more complex parts. So these were all elements that we excluded from the C-part management. All the other good categories we looked at closer, and all the drawn parts that go hand in hand with that, all the elements where we need certificates, and now, most importantly, everything that has and carries an item number and has an expiry date, where we ourselves, I mean, we talked about this yesterday, where we need to get the transparency, where we need to get transparency through digitization. How do you manage to get that digitalization right? It's catchwords, but if come to the nitty-gritty where you really want to know where does the part come from, when does it expire, can that O-ring, for example, still be used? Here you will find that we've got over 1,000 items for, well, washers and rubber parts, for example, that we handed over to the C-part management. Now, the number of suppliers that we cut down was 600 different suppliers. And with that, of course, our focus was on our C-part service providers. Because now we could say, okay, how do we want to integrate? How do we want to link up with them? And that brings us, of course, to the whole issue of digitalization. I mean, we keep talking about this, and then if you look at it, it means how do you, for example, send out an order for 20 or 30,000 articles to one or two suppliers? How do you give them a forecast? How much of these you will need? So that they can also have a kind of a schedule. And this issue is one that we did either via, as you see here, EDI, or we use SharePoint files or other media that we use to transfer data between us and the service provider. That means every Tuesday we send out to the service provider every Tuesday list of every article and how many we will need for the next 18 months. And, of course, we've got a commitment to procure these. It's a 6 months procurement obligation, which means the service provider can think then for himself, will he just, so to say, stock up his goods for 6 months or for 1.5 years, for 18 months? And, of course, then, as a procurement, I say, I look at availability for the various materials, and then I want to know, hey, where's the money? Where's the money? I, as the procurement guy, I have to make sure that we generate savings. And so, to this end, we've got a contract that's hundreds of pages long that defines every single process in due detail. And here, we also defined quite clearly what are the savings that we want to generate. Of course, we all know that as a procurement manager or somebody in production that has responsibility to generate savings, how do you want to actually recoup that money for the company? I mean, you can't negotiate with 600 different suppliers, so you say you go to the C-part supplier, and it's his job. It's his job. I mean, I've got a contract with him, and well, I need the money. It's, of course, a very simplified presentation, but it's a long process, and my colleagues from direct and indirect material are also here with us today, with me. So we're standing in for C-part management. We know how to do it, and for us it was important to say, look, what we've managed here in direct commodities is something we now also, well, achieve in the indirect goods and services that we procure. And here, look once more at what I've just said. The quality needs to be right. Quality needs to be right for production. The quality needs to be right for the article itself that we procure, that we get the right part, that the drawings are kept and maintained, that we have a high material availability. All of these issues were something that we had to deal with and address, and we had an extremely strong delivery faithfulness for over 80% for all these articles, and we had no faulty parts, no erroneous parts, because we've got the availability through this procurement commitment, through long-term commitments and through long-term savings that we can generate. As I said, I'd like to switch now to the indirect area, because that's where I work, and to take a look at the future. Now, with us, the future, as we intended and planned it, was that for indirect material, where we have far, far more suppliers, because, I mean, with the indirect, we are talking just for the C-part management, about 1,300 different suppliers that we looked at closer. 1,300 suppliers. But where do you start? Where do you start with them? Which commodities do you look at? And then, in indirect material, you don't have any clearly allocated requirements. You need a hammer today or another hammer tomorrow. The same is true for screwdrivers or the article. I mean, the article is never the same a year later than it was the year before. And so we said, oh God, we've got problems here. We won't even get the quantities right. We are far too small for these quantities. And that's, of course, where we came together in this forum that we're also here today. Here, you're generating problems that necessitate to talk with others, to find solutions together with others and say, look, I want to have, for example, programming from my C-part management. But the first one you hear from your supplier says, well, that will cost you money. That's not a standard. How do you expect me to do that? It'll cost you extra. And so we teamed up with other companies, and you can see this here on the right top of the slide, because in our indirect procurement, we've started an alliance here with those companies listed, Rote Schwarze Zeiss, you can read them yourself, and we said, well, let's get on board of this MRO project. Who actually has the needs? Who has the requirements for what kind of commodities? And then you realize, well, they all have needs, they all have requirements, and they all buy from whoever you name them, for whatever provider they do. But, of course, we all just need specific services that we procure, and we need to get the volumes right as well. And so we teamed up, as you see here, and said, look, I by myself, as the Knorr brake, or a Brose, for example, by himself, we just don't generate that volume. We don't have that planning and budget. So we came up with the idea to say, okay, let's take a look at that specific service provider, and he will go through all the commodities. That's what we did. Well, roughly a year ago, we started and brought this model to market that was completely new. And everybody says, no, I don't need these parts, I don't need these parts, I've got no procurement guide. So discussions, no end to them. So we said, look, I don't care. Let's just say, we split up the commodities, and underneath these, we will then bundle the suppliers. Which means the 1,300 suppliers that we have will now, in future, be allocated to 4 or 5 commodities, clear categorization, and then they, well, not one will get them all, but he will be allocated by commodity. We will look at the suppliers by commodity, so that we then can negotiate together with Brose, together with Osram, with these suppliers. And of course, that was an issue when you looked at antitrust, because somebody said, you're too strong, you will be able to, well, pressurize the supply in an undue way. So once again we said, let's have a look at the market share. Which supplier is going to go with that strategy? And we'll ask them, will you go along with that strategy, yes or no? Which meant at the end of the day, we've now managed that within 18 months, we are able to, well, clock up a volume, which for us ourselves is 45 million euros, to have 4 million euros in, well, all due brevity, handed out to 8 different suppliers that have been clearly allocated to their specific commodities. And now their task is, when you look at the C part, service provider, MRO, service provider, whatever you call them, to thrash out concepts together with us that are by all means complex. And only yesterday we had a meeting where we said, look, we want to hand you over those and those suppliers. No further discussion. You take over those and those suppliers, and that's the volume where I want to generate XY savings. That's what we need to discuss. What's the savings that we can generate in a long-term contract with you? Well, so it's a long story cut short here. Which parts, which commodities did you look at, or did we look at the end of the day? And as you can see, here you have them. We've got electronic parts, we've got tools, we've got safety equipment, we've got mechanical parts, we've got consumer parts. I mean, that is, of course, a wealth of things. Could be glues, it could be adhesives, you name them, anything. And as you can see last year, inventory and storage goods. So, when it comes to C part management, direct material, we've had things that were drawn up, but here these were not things where we've got sample, we've got drawings. So with the consolidation, we want to create standards and solutions that we get from our suppliers to say, no, I don't want to have that specific glove. No, we all have the same requirement. We want a specific tool from what that product, so that can generate a saving of, let's say, for example, 25%. And as you can see now, next, we also decided which suppliers will then be strategic suppliers for us, those that will be preferred, the preferred suppliers, and also those that we want to discontinue. If you look at 1,300 suppliers, then that means that at least 1,200 will be discontinued. Suppliers that will no longer play an important role for us. But of course, if I want to have the original product, that will be then procured indirectly. So we said, here, for example, look at the Word Group, which of course is quite sizable and big, but has a host of individual little companies, which of course is tricky for me, because I said, look, Word has a huge procurement volume where you can generate savings, and he's got a procurement power, but of course I had to learn otherwise. That's quite different from what I had thought. So it wasn't everything about easy here in that regard. And here you can see once more quite clearly that there's certain areas like mechanics and inventories we've not really decided with who we would go together. That's the process that we're in right now. But what's the implementation? You see that here. I just said we want to be connected to them, closely connected, and so we talked about systems that we would use, where we would team up and link up directly with our C-part service provider, but found it was impossible. Too much data, too much different data, and an issue that we had to, well, force for far too long, trying to find a solution. So we abandoned this at the first step and said, okay, we'll have to find a different platform, simple systems or whatever, where we can really map this. And when we came to take a decision, you can see that we very quickly decided these parts can be allocated to various different countries, and it just says supplier A, B, C, which means these are the preferred suppliers for these commodities in these countries. And we were able to implement that in these given countries very quickly. Now, I just said that we've got this procurement alliance that supports us when it comes to expertise and know-how. You see that here, where we can exchange ideas, problems, issues, where you can exchange strategies of one another, and you can also exchange ideas about the solutions that you have or want to offer. And here you can see that we at Knorr Bremse, all the departmental heads were invited for these commodities, and we said, look, let's come up with a plan together and let's negotiate together. At first, of course, well, we found it's a bit critical because everybody was afraid of this procurement power that we would then, so to say, generate. Yesterday, for example, I spoke with Renus and we said, look, if we team up for logistics, what will happen? What will that mean? But interesting to note, suppliers also spoke at this forum, and they said, I'm just going to speak with one. I'm just going to speak with a Knorr Bremse, and he will deputize for all the other companies in that alliance. So all these sales and procurement structures that a company, for example, with that a service provider has to talk with 8 different companies is something that was completely omitted. So you have a huge advantage, or they could also perceive a huge advantage in having all of this being conducted as an open book policy, and to have clearly defined targets as far as the price is concerned and deliverability is concerned. So what do you have to take good care of if you start this in this triadic relationship? As you can see, all suppliers here in the bottom blue box, that will be the 1,300 suppliers here that you see, and at the top there, the alliance partners. And from this portfolio of the many suppliers, you then want to find the right C-part manager for each commodity. What do you need to heed and what do you need to consider here? What's the benefit? Well, you can see it clearly. It's the exchange of expertise. It's not the price that was at the top of the agenda. No, it is an exchange of expertise. To develop joint material and commodity groups, and to also have, participation in the opportunities and risks. For example, yesterday we talked at length about the risks and opportunities. For example, semiconductors, the lack of availability for semiconductors. Thank God we weren't so affected at Knorr Bremse, because we early on developed a system to say we will buy huge amounts of them. But of course, we were also slightly affected by this semiconductor crisis. But me, as a procurement manager, I say, okay, look, my resources, we're far too expensive. Working out of Munich, we're far too expensive. We need to reduce the procurement managers. But where then? Where then do you create and where do you get the know-how, the expertise? And you talk about business service centers that you have abroad, but I don't think that's really worth it. We've tried this, but you lose the expertise, you lose the know-how. Got personnel changes, and so we felt digitalization is so important here. But the individual connection that you talk about with the suppliers, that's the bigger discussion. How do you implement that connection to the individual supplier? And are you willing to do so, and how much is it going to cost you? So, what did we do together in the alliance, in the procurement alliance, to have that MRO and to get it up and running, to make it fly? Well, defined our informal benchmarks, and at the same time we also, of course, have market information that we peruse, that we exchange. We've got evaluations of suppliers, which ones are good, which ones do you think we should use. Then we negotiate it together, and we even want to go as far, but that's a little bit of work ahead of us, to develop a joint supply chain. So, to say exactly, how do I get all the logistics of that realized? And of course, it's a problem that everybody has. And somebody looks more or less at a given issue, and that, of course, is that huge advantage and benefit of this alliance. Now, I just said in this alliance we talk about a host of different commodities. I'm not going to go run you through all these commodities, but as you can see, we as Knorr Bremse, and we are not that small really, but nonetheless, you see here, and we've got an annual revenue of 6.5 and 7 billion euros. We're still pretty small when you look at the wider market. And so we looked at all these indirect commodities that you see listed here on the right-hand side. These are all done together with 8 other companies. Now, don't know how much time I've got left, but it's pretty early in the day still. I hope now that this has been of some interest for you, and of course I also hope that I've been able to, I've at least been able to address or answer some of the questions you may have. How do we do the C-part management? How automated is our C-part management? In the first slide I may have been a bit too quick, glossing over the right-hand side, how integrated, how close we work with the various service providers. I can maybe... Sorry, I can see you already coming up here on stage, or had to come up here on stage. But for us, the issue was, how close do we want to work with a C-part service provider? And we took it to such extremes that we had no inventories of those parts in our production anymore. But for example, if you have the situation that you want to build a compressor tomorrow, day after today, and then of course our disposition, our scheduling, what do we need for that production tomorrow? And then you will find that the work preparation guy had to list or had to clear the work preparation order. Nobody knew exactly which articles we needed, but from that item list to then build a compressor, for example, you need 100 parts for those, 60 of these would coming from our C-part provider. And if the work scheduler then presses a given button and say, look, tomorrow I want to build that compressor, it doesn't take longer than 5 minutes, then if such an order is released our C-part supplier. And tomorrow I've got 2 springs, 1 O-ring, 5 hearting, plugs and switches, 7, you name them. So we've got 60 products individually packaged on site. And then we realize, wow, I mean, we've got only one provider who can do that. And we're so dependent on that single provider. And so we felt this is dependency that we want to reduce, although it was cumbersome and it took a lot of effort. But now, I mean, for example, we've got packaging units that are delivered to us, or that we have them handled by our incoming goods department, that we have them also stored in Cardex and the likes, so that we maintain the management of the product directly. So we say, from 100 screws, I only take 2 of that item number with that surface coating, plus those O-ring that has durability until a given expiry date, and that's still in order for us. All of that was something that we brought back in-house so that we, of course, can become more attractive again for these C-part suppliers. Because we yesterday saw, of course, I mean, if you looked at these little packages, 100 pieces, and then Kanban, and off they go. We hate Kanban. Why do we hate Kanban? Well, because, I mean, really, I hate Kanban, because Kanban takes up huge amount of space. Everybody takes whatever he needs, whatever he wants, and you've got, I mean, boxes being mixed up, being confused. Item numbers, it started with the one and with the other one. I mean, it's been dormant in the Kanban shelf for half a year. We don't even know which item numbers, which lot numbers are still out there and circulating. So all of that was something that we did away with. I mean, we really flattened it. I'm not a friend of Kanban, as you would have heard, because we sell safety and we need to know exactly what is contained in which product and which component. Enough has been said. I thank you very much. And of course, at the plenary discussion later on, I will be available for your questions. And please do pester me with your questions, because I want to hear from you. What's the problems you have? And are we doing something right, or are we not getting right? So thank you very much.